And here with us is Dennis Young, President and CEO of Ittner Architects, and we also have joining us from law enforcement, the Lieutenant Jerry Lohr, Tactical Ops at St. Louis County Police. And Lieutenant, welcome to the program.
Thank you, John. It's a pleasure to be here.
And Dennis, I want to have you again talk a little bit about the communication that happens between Ittner and law enforcement agencies.
Well, I tell you where it begins is in the early planning and design phases of the project. We had Jerry in our office just last week reviewing some plans. And having that kind of expertise and another set of eyes on how schools should operate from a law enforcement perspective is just vital. Years ago, we didn't have that kind of expertise adding to the benefit of the project. So it's been great.
Talk a little bit about Tactical Ops. What is your job, especially as concerns a call that may come in from a school?
Okay. Clearly, being in the Division of Special Operations lends itself to kind of a different type of a response. And so what you see on the news, which the cameras tend to focus on, are the armored vehicles, the guys in kits. And clearly we are a part of a response to a school shooting, an active shooter event. The reality is the first responders are going to be your SROs, are going to be your patrol officers, the guys that are riding those beats that are in those areas. We're more of a back-end response, just due to the nature of these events usually take place pretty quickly. So the reality is they don't normally go over 12 minutes. Statistically, the average length of a school shooting and of an active shooter event is about 12 minutes.
Doesn't give you a lot of time to respond.
No. So the reality, right, so exactly. The reality for us to be able to stage and get there to get our equipment, I like to think we can be anywhere within 30 to 45 minutes, but the reality is a school shooting type event is probably going to be over before we get there.
So what happens on a day like today is ever more important because you have to set the pieces in place to make sure that you've got the tools that you need.
Absolutely.
And thus the communication with it.
Right.
Right, and Dennis and I have talked about this, and this is a huge process. And so you start at the very initial beginnings of it, which is the planning of how do we build our schools, and what things do we need to put in place, and not only from a school district perspective. So I have children that go to high school, and I don't want my children to go to a building where it's a correctional facility. I want them to go to a place where they're comfortable and they can get a good education. But I want to balance that with being able to limit access points. From a law enforcement perspective, the way I view things is going to be slightly different than maybe a superintendent or a faculty member. Not necessarily as aesthetically pleasing, but more functional. And so it's a balance. But that's the first step, and then we talk about education. So how do we educate faculty members? How do we educate superintendents? How do we educate teachers? What is their response going to be in an event like this? And then we shift that and we talk about how do we educate police officers? So what kind of response do we have from a law enforcement perspective? And I can tell you, with being a member of the St. Louis County Police Department, we are very proactive in that piece. In 2012, we reached out to every school district in St. Louis County, and we did a site assessment. We walked through every building, every school in St. Louis County, met with the principals, met with the superintendents. And granted, it wasn't an elaborate 4-day process, but we spent time in every building just walking through and saying, hey, where are your vulnerabilities? What things can we do differently? Do you have policies in place? Let us give you some suggestions. And that was the kind of the beginning of this partnership with the school districts, and we've continued to build on that. I like to think that we're continuing to build that relationship.
Jerry Lohr is here with us, Lieutenant with the St. Louis County Police Department, and Dennis said something fascinating last hour about the fact that you need to limit the accessibility for the bad guys, but you need to make sure when you can get in, you can get in.
Absolutely.
How do you manage that?
It's a great point. If you kind of envision a school shooting and look at remember the images you see on the news, there are multiple access points to a school. And in most of the more recent school shooting events, the option-based programs that are now being taught, you have children or students fleeing the building, which is now opening up all of those access points. So yes, it's a concern. If I'm an initial responder, how do I get in that building? The reality is most of those doors are being opened by people evacuating. Now granted, every school district's different, so there are option-based programs that are teaching people to shelter in place, to go to a safe room if that's what if you have one. And so there are some concerns. One of the things that we stress with the county police is familiarization with your school. So if I'm assigned as a young policeman, I know my field training officer taught me. He took me to every school in our beat, and he walked me in, and I met the secretary, I met the principal, and then we walked that building. And he impressed upon me, and I like to believe that still happens, that our field training officers are still impressing upon our young officers, you have to know these facilities.
Everybody remembers the first day of high school and how different the place looked from what you knew of it later on.
Absolutely. And so it's important for us to know those layouts, and it's important for us to know where are these access points. I know where the cooks, which doors the cooks open or prop open because it's too hot.
It was interesting. Yeah, his knowledge goes really deep because
I can tell.
when we visited the other day, I'm not going to mention any names of the school district, but we're working on a preliminary design for a new high school to replace an existing high school that has well over 50 doors because it developed as a campus over time. And I asked Jerry to sit down, and he knew exactly what school it was.
Yeah, just coincidence,
He
but
just
I was
knew
very
exactly.
familiar. I remember answering burglar alarm
Yeah.
calls at 2 in the morning at that building.
Yeah.
And I was familiar enough with that school. I knew where I could pull around the backside, and I could normally guess which door was open.
Yeah. So now we're going to be tearing down a lot of those older buildings, but some,
Sure.
will be reused because they are still very usable. But having that knowledge and then applying it to the new designs, because you know what you're dealing with now, and just think if you could resolve all those issues and have really a perfect situation for you that's well thought out from a law enforcement standpoint, it's really important.
When he mentioned sheltering in place, again, it's a different philosophy. Things are changing all the time, and that's part of what you talked about last hour is that transformation in school security.
Yeah.
What does Ittner do about the fact that now there are times when you're going to have somebody shelter in place to make sure that place is a safe place to hunker
Oh,
down?
absolutely. One of the things we're doing that we kind of innovated a couple of years ago was some of these safe places serve two purposes, both from an intruder standpoint and also from severe weather.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And also to make it age appropriate. So, for instance, if we're doing a pre-K, you can't have these young kids running down the hall, 10 classrooms down the hall to a safe place. They have to go someplace immediately.
Right.
So, we've created what we call Cubby Rooms that are between two classrooms.
Yeah, we talked about this being
Yeah.
something familiar.
Something familiar.
So, age appropriate, a familiar place, not necessarily scary. It's not the place they only go when bad things are happening. Just to help alleviate some of that stress in that moment.
Right.
And one of the things that Dennis and I talked about, and this is something that's extremely important to me from a law enforcement perspective, is the time and the response time. And so limiting access, having safe rooms. If you look statistically, again, I mentioned earlier, most of these events last no longer than 12 minutes. Most of them are over in about 5.
Mm-hmm.
But the statistical analysis shows that you have a person either injured or killed about every 15 seconds.
Wow.
So that's roughly 4 every minute.
Wow.
And so if you can imagine, if I can create a barrier, some kind of deterrent, something to even slow that person down for 1 minute, potentially I'm saving or deterring that, that I'm preventing those injuries.
Save 4 lives.
4
for
lives,
that 1 minute,
essentially.
sure.
And so a motivated individual, the reality, unfortunately, in the world we live in, a motivated individual is going to be able to accomplish something horrific. And so, although we need to do things to prevent it, and we need to do everything we can to prevent it, the reality is from a law enforcement perspective, it's helping to slow this down. So it's putting somebody in a safe room where they prevent denying access. It's limiting access points, or at least slowing down somebody from getting through those access points. And that's part of the focus.
And we've also been focusing on, because of what happened in Florida, the worst of the worst events. That's not the only reason why you could be called out to a school. Does every school, every high school anyway, in St. Louis County have an SRO?
Yeah, almost every high school does, yes. Now, not all of them are through the county police, depending on which municipality. So you do have, you have schools that are in different cities, Chesterfield, Maryland Heights, Florissant, and they do have SROs. Again, the unfortunate reality is that SRO may not always be at that school. We like to think they are, but
Right.
that officer may have to go to court. That officer may have to leave for an unforeseen reason. But yes, almost all of them do have an SRO on site.
Even so, that SRO is not going to be there at 2 o'clock when the burglar alarm goes off.
That's correct.
So talk about the other reasons why there may be a proper time for a police response at a school that don't necessarily have to do with an active shooter situation.
A great question. There are times that police have to respond to a school. Whether it's there's breaking news this morning about an incident in a county south of here.
Yep.
Involving an employee. So you do have those situations which may initially be unknowns. So any kind of threat to the school, obviously our number one priority. We know that there's a number of children in the building. There's faculty members. There's teachers. There's superintendents. There's custodians. And so any kind of threat is going to prompt a response. So whether it's an active shooter threat to the children, or whether it's a disgruntled parent, whether it's a disgruntled employee, those all prompt a police response to a school.
And that incident this morning, this is something I want to be very careful about because the amount of information we have is almost nothing. Right. But they did feel that whatever it was that they were investigating there was serious enough to make the call to tell kids stay home, and there's not going to be any school today. Have those triggers to close the school for the day, has that changed?
No, although I think right now you're going to see, because we're so close to Parkland, because that event is so fresh in our mind.
Nerves are fresh.
Right. You're going to see maybe an overreaction. And I hate to call it an overreaction because if there truly is a threat and we don't close a school, we don't do something like that and something bad happens, I can't imagine the regret and the feelings of sorrow and grief that we would cause. So it is vitally important. And while it may be an overreaction, again, I like to think we don't play anything cheap. So I would rather close the school. I would rather have to deal with daycare issues for my children for a day, but know that they're safe.
And Dennis, again, it's going to be very gratifying for you to have resources like the St. Louis County Police. Do you get that same kind of response from police agencies across the state and the state police?
You really have to reach out. You have to say now's the time to get together. And some of the ideas that we're incorporating in the schools, it's kind of interesting. We talked about the front door, the entry.
Yeah.
The vestibule, if you will. To use an old kind of design feature from law enforcement, you call it the sally port.
Right.
A sally port means you walk into a room, the door behind you closes, the other door doesn't open until the one behind you closes, and someone has to open it for you. So we're doing a middle school right now in Illinois where the superintendent wants the waiting room to be in that sally port, if you will, area. We call it the welcome center. Lots of glass around, security film, easy for the receptionist to view what's going on and check the behavior of the people in that room. But, you get divorce situations, or
Sure.
you get somebody who, is just has some mental health or anger issues that are coming to school.
Right.
Because
and what Dennis is hitting on is exactly the point. It's about buying time. So it's buying time, and it's also about education. So it's teaching that first line of defense, if you want to call it that, or your first encounter, welcome center type folks, which is usually a secretary and administrative type person. So when I go to pick up my child from a school and I buzz in, the first person I talk to is usually a secretary type administrator, but it's incumbent. That's where that education piece comes in. That's that piece where they're going to delay me. If I'm there for nefarious reasons, they're going to delay me. And it's also about educating them as to what is the appropriate response. If I'm not comfortable with this person who's trying to get into my building, what do I do?
Now, when you review these designs, you would never know that area is secured. You would not guess.
Right.
It's
a security feature is a security
it's very comfortable. It's spacious. It has all the same ceiling kind of design and lighting. But at the end of the day, that space is being monitored and controlled by a person who's been trained.
And one of the things that we saw in Florida that's a little bit different is you get farther and farther north. I remember the schools I went to in Western New York were all, you went inside and you never went outside because it's January and nobody wants that. Right. But in Florida, there were all of those open hallways and things like that. And Ittner, I know, is very focused on making a setting as natural as can be. But how do you deal with the fact that there is, in fact, an outdoors that's part of the school day?
Well, it kind of depends on the age. If we're talking, say, pre-K through 2, what we're doing is designing center courtyards that are very large, that are play centers. And they're very nice, by the way.
Sure.
And the kids are there and they're secure. They're not running off. You're not having someone in a car driving up next to the playground, talking to the student. You're not having, you can't get shot.
You can't get close.
Yeah, can't get close. And it's very secure, and the parents and the teachers just love it to have that kind of design. Now, you can't do that as you get some of the older kids because, you know, they need more room to play. And it's always a design issue on how do you design those playgrounds in such a way that clear lines of sight, they're not up next to a wooded area.
Right.
You know?
And it also lends in, I mean, I think I still went to high school when we were still allowed to go outside to smoke. I don't think they allow that anymore.
Nope.
But you had open campuses. You
Yeah.
could, you know, as a senior, junior, senior, you could leave to go to lunch. So the campus was very open. And so now we're kind of at that point where we have to reevaluate those style of campuses.
Yes.
Are there ways that we can retrofit them? Can we put some kind of barrier? Can we fence it?
Right.
And then school districts need to reevaluate their policies on, do we allow students to leave for lunch? Do we limit that access? But those are questions the school districts are going to have to answer.
Yeah, and again, it's great to hear that there's so much work that's being done on an active and ongoing basis to address all of these concerns as the world changes. So, Lieutenant Jerry Lohr, Tactical Operations of the St. Louis County Police, thank you so much for being with us and being a part of this.
Thanks, I really appreciate it.